Meanwhile, Saul was still breathing out murderous threats against the Lord's disciples. He went to the high priest and asked him for letters to the synagogues in Damascus, so that if he found any there who belonged to the way, whether men or women, he might take them as prisoners to Jerusalem. As he neared Damascus on his journey, suddenly a light from heaven flashed around him. He fell to the ground and heard a voice say to him, "Saul, why do you persecute me?" "Who are you, Lord?" Saul asked. "I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting," he replied. "Now get up and go into the city, and you will be told what you must do." The men traveling with Saul stood there speechless. They heard the sound, but did not see anyone. Saul got up from the ground, but when he opened his eyes, he could see nothing. So they led him by the hand into Damascus. For 3 days he was blind and did not eat or drink anything.
Thank you, Andy. One of the great stories of the Bible. Charlie, I'll hand over to you.
Great. Thank you very much, Rick. Good morning. It's great to have you with us this morning. As you know, we have been working our way through the book of Matthew, but we are taking a break at the beginning of the year. Well, there's a discipline about working your way through a book faithfully. It removes some of the subjectivity of choosing topics to preach on. And we're going to get back to Matthew in a few weeks' time. I think it'll probably take us another 18 months to get towards the end of the book. So every now and again, we're going to take a break. And that's what I wanted to do at the moment, because I just wanted to pick up on a conversation we started maybe a couple of months ago about sustaining a lifelong faith. We had a wonderful day here yesterday. It was a beautiful day celebrating Nathaniel and Sophia's wedding. And it's a great way to start their life together. But any of us who've been married sometime will know that the wedding is not the marriage. And a marriage takes work. There are fantastic, wonderful moments, and there are challenges. And there are some times when we need to go and find help, somebody we can talk to about sustaining a marriage. I don't think that's a bad metaphor for faith, because it's easy to come to faith in a flurry of emotion, having met Jesus. But actually, that's quite difficult to sustain, different to sustaining a faith over 50 years. There are ups and there are downs along the journey. So what I wanted to do for these few weeks was think a little bit about some of that topic. And I hope and pray that it is helpful. In Genesis chapter 1, verse 5, it says, God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening, and there was morning, the first day. What's interesting about that passage is the new day starts in the evening in Jewish thought. We often think about the new day with the dawn, but in Jewish consciousness, the new day starts at sundown. The Sabbath starts on Friday evening. If you've ever been to Israel, everything shuts on a Friday evening, and that's when the Sabbath starts. Each new day starts in the dark, where you're not able to see. Creation comes out of nothing. Light comes out of darkness. And often as we walk through light, we find that the darkest nights come before the brightest dawns. Friends, that is good news for anyone who finds themselves in the midst of darkness. New life, new insights, new growth often only comes after a period of struggle and darkness. George MacDonald was one of C.S. Lewis's biggest influences. He cites him. George MacDonald wrote a slightly strange fantasy novel called Lilith. It's a journey of faith, but it's wrapped up in this strange fantasy novel of metaphor and allegory. I think it's possibly where Lewis got the idea for then going on to write his Narnia books, a fantasy book about faith. The characters in the book, the lead character is a Mr. Vane. And Mr. Vane is on this, all sounds a bit Pilgrim's Progress, doesn't it? Mr. Vane is on a journey of faith, and his mentor and his guide is a strange character known as Mr. Raven. Mr. Raven sometimes appears as a raven. Sometimes he appears as an old librarian. And he's Mr. Vane's spiritual guide. And at one point in the book, they have this conversation. Mr. Raven says to Mr. Vane, "Come on, let's go. I'm quite content where I am. You think so, but you are not." Mr. Vane's true home was a place where he had not yet been. I like that idea. Sometimes we think we're happy and we're content, but it's simply because we don't know what we don't know. It's amazing the number of people I've spoken to over the years who are in a crisis because they've lost a particular job. And that's very disconcerting and it's very worrying. And you can go through a period where you really do feel in the dark and lost. 18 months, they find something new. And a few months in, this was the best decision I ever made. Okay? You find yourself in a new opportunity that you didn't know was there yet, but you needed a bit of a push. Sometimes I think that complacency, not doubt, is the greatest enemy to spiritual growth. And sometimes God needs to give us a push in order to move us on. We all have to go on a spiritual journey, lifelong growth, and sometimes that journey just goes through dark places. It doesn't mean that you're lost. It just means that the journey sometimes has to go through dark places, because that is the way forwards. You know, you're thinking, I used to have it all sorted, but now I'm not so sure. Well, congratulations, my friend, because now you are able to grow. In order to make real progress, you sometimes have to embrace unknowing. And by that, I mean a couple of things. I mean, we've got to learn some new ideas. Lifelong growth, keep learning, keep growing, learn new things. But sometimes it involves letting go of bad old ideas to make room for new ones. And that can be a painful process. But it's good, and it can be necessary. Are you with me? Which brings us to Saul of Tarsus. Saul is a man on a journey. We read that Saul was breathing threats of murder against the disciples. So he goes to the high priest and asks for letters to the synagogues at Damascus, so that if he found any who belonged to this strange sect, the Way, be it men or women, he could bring them bound to Jerusalem. Saul was born in Tarsus, but raised in Jerusalem. And he is the finest of biblical scholars. We read that he was trained under Gamaliel. In the culture of the day, that was a big name drop. I sat at the feet of Rowan Williams or N.T. Wright themselves and learnt my faith from them. He had an absolute elite education in Torah. He was your go-to Bible answer man. You're putting together your quiz team, you want him on the Bible round. He has the Torah undoubtedly committed to memory. He's a Pharisee and the most devout of them all. A zealous practitioner of religious certitude, one commentator said. He knew what he knew, and he knew that what he knew was right. And then he becomes aware of this strange sect. They're calling themselves the Way. And they have this dangerous idea that their character, Jesus of Nazareth, was the Messiah. Well, quite frankly, they need to be squashed. They needed to be rooted out and put right. And Saul was the man for the job. Because you see, Paul is absolutely certain that there is no way Jesus is the Messiah. And do you know why that is? It's because he's got the Bible verse for it. Deuteronomy 21:23 says, anyone hung on a tree is under God's curse. Therefore, Jesus, who was crucified, cannot be Israel's Messiah and under God's curse. It's not possible. He's got the verse. He knows this. Interestingly, as an aside, the crucifixion, not the resurrection, was the biggest stumbling block to the early Christians. Exactly for this reason. When Paul says we are to be fools for Christ, it's because we are to take this, that Jesus hung on a tree for us. That idea is in culture was just foolishness. It's not, as I had one guy at college say, I'm doing street work and I'm going to hold a billboard and shout at people and I'm going to be a fool for Christ. No, please don't do that. That doesn't really help anyone. To be a fool for Christ is to accept that this Jesus, the one that was crucified, could actually be God's Messiah. Well, Paul is zealous, and he's on his way to Damascus, where he's heard that there are some of these followers of the Way, and he's there to root out this sect. He has a head full of thoughts and a heart full of zeal. And interestingly, zeal, whenever it comes up in the Bible, is normally associated with violence. If somebody says they're zealous, it's generally because they've enacted violence in pursuit of their faith. And we know that Saul was present at the stoning of Stephen, the first Christian martyr. And now he has this letter from the high priest entitling him to go to the synagogues and root out members of the Way. So Saul sets off to Damascus, 130 miles north from Jerusalem. It is a good, long walk. And here's the thing about good, long walks. They give you plenty of time to think. And if we know anything about Saul, it's that he is a thinker. And I wonder if he's thinking about this passage in Deuteronomy, and he knows. Then he's thinking about this strange passage in Isaiah 53 about a suffering servant. And how might that fit into this picture? And then, because he's undoubtedly memorized the Psalms, because he would have prayed them most of the days of his life, he thinks of Psalm 22, where it talks about his hands and his feet were pierced. And he's wandering along the road, and he's musing, and he's wondering, and he's thinking. Or maybe he has Stephen on his mind, and the way that Stephen died praising Jesus. We don't really know, and it's too far. I can't get into Saul's mind. But suddenly, as he is approaching Damascus, a light appears and flashes all around him. And suddenly a light from heaven flashes around him, and he fell to the ground and heard a voice saying, "Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me?" He asked, "Who are you, Lord?" The reply came, "I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting. Get up, enter the city, and you will be told what to do." Interesting, the word that's used for Lord here is Kyrios. It's the word used for Yahweh. So it's not like Lord as in Sir. It's not Paul saying, "Who are you, sir?" It's, who are you, God? Who are you, Yahweh? And he replies, I am Jesus, the one whom you are persecuting. And at that moment, he is struck blind. Saul got up from the ground, and though his eyes were open, he could see nothing. So they led him by the hand and took him to Damascus. In a flash of light, Paul has gone from the high noon of certainty into the darkness of not knowing and confusion. He can no longer stride forward with confidence. Instead, he shuffles in the dark. His mean, confident stride has turned into a shuffle. I saw this quote. Instead of marching down the road with arrogant confidence, Saul gropes his way through the darkness, needing someone to lead him by the hand. And at last, Saul is making progress. It doesn't look like it, but he is accepting the help from another. And for an arrogant Pharisee like Saul, that is progress. In that moment, all he knows is that Jesus is Lord. He knows nothing else. Saul is not converting from one religion to another at this point. He is still within Judaism. Christianity, the way, is still within the fold of Judaism. He just knows that everything he held true, the map that he'd used to orientate his life, has been torn up. And his bearings have gone. But this he knows, that he has encountered God on the road. And God is Jesus. Jesus is Lord. I've been a Christian 35 years. And I think there are a couple of times on that journey where I found myself where Paul is. Just going, God, where's the map gone? Where are you? What am I doing? I don't know if you share that experience. For 3 days, he was without sight, and he neither ate nor drank. I don't think he was fasting. I just think he was completely stunned. This guy is in utter shock. Suddenly, Saul's world has been, to use the modern language, completely deconstructed. And literally and metaphorically, he is blind. But this he knows, that Jesus is Lord, and that he has encountered him. And this he will hang on to. In Damascus, there is a man, as we go on to look at the rest of the story, called Ananias. Ananias is living in Damascus, and God visits Ananias in the next section of this reading, and he says to him, go find Saul of Tarsus. I've got a plan for him. And in my paraphrase version, Ananias says, God, you have got to be joking. You know this, you know what this man is doing. You know what this man did to Stephen. You know what this man is doing to Christians. No, I have a plan for Saul. Go to Straight Street, where you will find him. He's there praying. And bring him to me. So Ananias went and entered the house. And he laid his hands on Saul and said, Brother Saul, the Lord Jesus, who appeared to you on your way here, has sent me so that you may regain your sight and be filled with the Holy Spirit. And immediately something like scales fell from his eyes, and his sight was restored. And then he got up and was baptized. And after taking some food, he regained his strength. Friends, on the road, Saul was blinded, disorientated, broken, and confused. But when Ananias addresses him as Brother Saul, he is converted. Saul came to Damascus to kill people like Ananias. And Ananias is here calling him brother. And the scales fell from his eyes. Much later, Saul, who becomes Paul, will pen the words of 1 Corinthians 13 about the supremacy of love. I do wonder if it's at this moment when his enemy embraces him and says, "Brother Saul," that the idea of the supremacy of love is born in his mind. Because love is more important than having right doctrine. Love is greater than having all of the answers. Love is greater than all of the zeal. As Paul says, the greatest of these is love. Paul had come to kill Ananias, and now he's sitting at a table sharing a meal with him, a feast of bread and of wine, the start of his new life. Paul has been converted from the zeal of religious violence to the power of co-suffering love. And as it said in the passage earlier, Ananias is going to tell Saul how much he must suffer for the sake of his name. And Paul would never again practice violence in the name of God or his faith. In fact, he would willingly suffer because of the transformation that happened to him on this road and his realization that Jesus is Lord. Another famous such encounter was John Newton. We know the hymn, don't we? Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now am found. I was blind, but now I see. Metaphorically, literally, the brightest dawns come after the darkest nights. Paul will rebuild, he will rethink his faith. He will go on to put together Isaiah 53 and Psalm 22, and he will become one of the greatest theologians the church has ever had. But just at this moment, he knows nothing except that Jesus is Lord. His foundation is no longer a set of intellectual arguments, a set of quotable Bible passages in his back pocket to prove why the other person was wrong. It is an encounter with Jesus on the road and the embrace of the Christian family, calling him brother. Friends, as you journey through faith, as you walk this path of faithful obedience together, there will be times of great highs, there will be times of real doubt and struggle. I've been a pastor long enough to know that that is true. But my appeal to you this morning is when you do find yourself in those moments, hang on to this, that Jesus is Lord. What you think about hell is secondary. What you think about women in ministry is secondary. What you think about same-sex marriage and relationships is secondary. There are good and bad ways to think about these things. I do strongly believe that. But they are not the fundamentals that define us. What defines us is this meal. Christ's body and blood broken and shed. Jesus is Lord. And when you find yourself in amongst the disorientation that inevitably comes in life, come back here. Come back to that promise that Jesus is Lord and hang on to that encounter. And it will see you through. It was Karl Barth who, having written his Church Dogmatics, which is a fearsome work of theology, I have dipped in and out of it for essays. I have not read it. It would take far too long. Karl Barth, after all of his thinking, after all of his theologizing, after all of his lecturing, was asked, Professor Barth, what's the most important thing you've ever learnt? And he replied, Jesus loves me. This I know. Because the Bible tells me so. And that's enough. Sometimes that has to be enough. But it is enough.